much, John, for that welcome. Is that working okay? Can I proceed? Yeah. I heard a little whistle in the background. I think maybe, should I stand a bit further away from there? Maybe, yes. Okay, well, remind me not to topple over. I always think of actors, when they're on the stage, when they're going to go over. Of course, they never do, because they're cleverer than I am. But thank you very much for your welcome and for supper. At one stage on the road, I was wondering whether I would make it for supper, because it took me 6.5 hours to get here, and I won't bore you with the details, but it's made me feel rather sort of tired, and it was good to have dinner and recover. Well, congratulations to SPUC for its 50th anniversary, and what a tremendous record of courage and of faithfulness that has been. So we do congratulate you on this very important anniversary, and it is a great privilege for me to be addressing you at the very beginning of this conference that is celebrating that anniversary. I know that SPUC is not in itself a religious or a Christian organization, though sometimes you might be forgiven for thinking that it is. That's not a bad thing. But because it's not formally, I just want to declare where I'm coming from. These days in universities, it's quite a fashion to declare your own bias. I think that's good, because for a long time universities were pretending that people there were neutral, which of course they are not. So my bias is that I'm speaking from the wide background, of course, of the scriptures and of the authoritative teaching of the church down the ages about these matters. People may not agree with that, and I hope that towards the end, Mr. Chairman, there will be time for some pushback if they don't. And I really wanted to begin by saying that I have a worldview, and I expect that most people in SPUC have a worldview. In fact, everyone has a worldview, whether it is declared or not. What is a worldview? Well, I suppose you could say it is the way in which we make sense of the world in which we live, of the societies in which we live, and most of all, of course, of ourselves. And not only intellectually, but also in terms of our emotions, our relationships. All of those things go into what makes for a worldview. Now, this is where my bias will come out. For Christians, that worldview begins with the importance of personal knowledge. The knowledge of one another as persons. I will come back to that word in a moment. But most of all, of God's disclosure of himself as a person. So for us, God is not just a regulative idea that helps us to be good. He is not just the explanation of the universe. But God is someone who speaks personally, of course supremely in the incarnation of our Lord Jesus Christ, but also in the story of his people, in the Bible, and in the continuing history of the church and its teaching. So in all of those ways, God is encountered personally. And personhood, therefore, is absolutely central to how Christians should think of themselves, of other people, and of the human race in general. Having said that, worldview, of course, is also about the world, about the universe as it is. Christians can, I think, justifiably think differently about the universe, how it's come into being, how life has emerged, how life develops, all of those things. But one thing they cannot give up is that the universe is purposive. It has not only an overriding, overreaching purpose, but that there are purposes being achieved by creatures within the universe all the time, ourselves, of course, included. I say this because much of the thrust of modern science is, of course, either to ignore or even worse, to deny that there is any such purpose. And so the teaching of the Church that we ourselves and the world in which we live are teleological, that is to say, are capable of achieving purposes and are moving towards a destiny. This is very important for persons and for the world as a whole. The way in which, the lengths to which scientists, for instance, have gone to deny this, we can perhaps discuss later on. But this is also true of life. Again, we may have different views about how life has emerged and how life has developed. But if you see the typical Attenborough film, what do you see? You see nature red in tooth and claw, don't you? You see competition for survival. And that comes, again, from a particular worldview. But from our point of view, we could equally well notice cooperation rather than conflict. That also exists in the world. Symbiosis, you will know about from your biology classes, but in all sorts of ways, in human societies, amongst animals, and even in plants, there is cooperation. There is what Father Teilhard called the complexification of life, how it becomes increasingly complex. And this has now been shown to be true even of the human cell. The irreducibility of the complexity of the cell. There is the emergence of consciousness. So it's not just the emergence of life, but of consciousness, and then of course of self-consciousness. How we are able to observe the universe in which we find ourselves. I mean, that's a kind of miracle. It's a double miracle, because there is a universe to be observed, and then there is we as persons who can observe it. You know, the fact that we are so used to doing so shouldn't blind us to the miracle, or the two miracles that we are looking at. Of course, this worldview includes what we think of human society, of human communities. And I begin with communities because the Bible begins with community. See, when God made man and woman, He made them together. They are given a common mission, the so-called family mandate and the cultural mandate that they were given to go forth, to multiply and to increase, and to have a proper stewardship over the rest of creation. We begin, therefore, with community. We cannot, as it were, do away with it. And again, I say this because so many of our problems that we encounter in the world today arise because a lot of our thinking begins with the individual, not the community. And this goes back to John Locke, to the Enlightenment, and to the idea that individuals have somehow, for their own protection, entered a social contract. Now, this social contract has been variously interpreted, of course. So Hobbes saw the individual before the social contract as living a life that was nasty, brutish, and short. But Rousseau, another Enlightenment thinker, had a completely different view. He saw the individual before society as a kind of noble savage who was spoiled by the social contract, by entering into community and into society. In the sense of Hobbes and Rousseau, Christians can never be social contractarians. This is worth noting because community or society for its existence depends on mutual obligation, mutual and proportionate obligation. So I have obligations towards other people in my family, in the wider community, in the nation, and they have obligations towards me. Once you begin to deny this mutuality, then you are on a slippery slope to barbarianism. And of course, excessive individualism that we find all around us is precisely leading us into that kind of denial and therefore that kind of barbarism. Then, of course, we come to the person. Within the context of the universe in which we find ourselves, of society in which we find ourselves, we come to the person. And the idea of the person, as we understand it today, is a particularly Christian one. If you don't believe me, read Larry Seidentop's book, The Invention of the Individual, in which he says that it is a myth to think that the individual, he calls the person the individual, he thinks it's a myth that the individual was invented by the Enlightenment. He takes it back to St. Paul, secular historian, and he says that before Christianity, all the other religions of the world were religions of the tribe or the family or the empire. If you think about it. It was Christianity with its emphasis, and particularly Pauline Christianity, with its emphasis on the relation of the person to God, the importance of personal commitment and faith, that brought personhood into sharp focus. As Christian ideas about the person made in God's image developed, conscience is once again the product of Christian thinking. You don't find too much about conscience elsewhere and before Christian thinking. But the idea of conscience, that people have God's law implanted in their hearts and their minds, and that this conscience has to be formed. That was one of the tasks of the church, of course, was properly to form people's consciences. And if churches are not doing that, then they are failing in a very important aspect of their duty. How conscience is to be formed? The idea of consent. That however godly society may be, people have to consent to how they are governed. You see, this goes back to Deuteronomy and to the idea of a constitutional monarchy in ancient Israel. Constitutional monarchy hasn't just emerged out of nowhere, it has very deep roots. The idea that people need to consent to how they are governed is, of course, fundamental to democracy. And then, of course, the recognition of a common humanity. Now, this was seen very sharply in the debates after the discovery of the New World, where there were many people, many Christians included, who were quite content to deny the humanity of the original inhabitants of the Americas. They stood to gain a great deal by doing so. Against them stood the Dominicans and to some extent the Jesuits as well, but the person that I'm thinking of is Bishop Las Casas, the Bishop of Mexico, who upheld the full humanity of the Indians. They thought they'd reached India, but of course they were mistaken about that. They were mistaken about much else as well, but we won't go into that. He upheld the full humanity of the Indians, whether they became Christian or not. Their right to work, their right to family life, their right to land, all of these things. And it was through his work that the debate about fundamental human rights came to Europe, to the University of Salamanca, which was of course a Dominican foundation. And it was these debates that planted the idea of fundamental, inalienable rights that human beings have in the European mind. So John Locke, for instance, in his arguments about human rights, almost word for word, re-expresses what Las Casas and the Dons at Salamanca were writing. From the Christian point of view then, the person is seen to have an inalienable dignity. That is to say, a dignity that cannot be taken away from him or her by other human beings. This is recognized very widely. Of course, it comes from the biblical teaching that human beings are made in God's image. But it is also found in the American Declaration of Independence, in the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights, in the European Convention, and many other places. Dignity that cannot be taken away. Why can it not be taken away? This is not simply that you and I have come together for mutual benefit and made a contract with one another. This is something much deeper than that. In fact, this is a transcendent value. Sometimes when we keep arguing back to basic things, we come across something that cannot simply be shown by human argument. It cannot be established by its usefulness, for instance, and it cannot be established by invoking simply the social contract. So some years ago, Parliament was discussing a bill which was called the Mental Incapacity Bill, I think it was called. And somebody pointed out, you've got all those bills there, I don't know if you've got that one, because, well, you probably don't, because they changed its title. Somebody pointed out that this was a very infelicitous title. So they changed it to the Human Capacity Bill, but the contents remained the same of the draft. Anyway, in the pre-legislative discussions that sometimes take place over bills, we were talking about this, and a very leading philosopher who is responsible for much of the legislation that you fight against, sort of jumped up and said, but of course, dignity can never be taken away from human beings, whatever state they are in. Whether they're in a coma or in a persistent vegetative state, so-called, and so on. So I asked her, you probably know now who I'm talking about. I said to her, what makes you say this? And she said, oh, she said, it's the Judeo-Christian idea, isn't it, that we are made in God's image. I said, well, I believe that. I'm very glad to hear you say this also. So sometimes we have to invoke something that is transcendent, even when we are engaged in legislative work. And I mean, I'm not a great fan, I'm sure you are not, of the Human Fertilization and Embryology Act. But at the very beginning, the Act recognizes, and it recognized it in a stronger way earlier, of the special status of the human embryo. Well, why? Why should it do so? Why is the human embryo different from other human tissue? You know, why did they need to create an HFEA for a start? There was already a human tissues authority in existence. So, inalienable dignity attaches, of course, to the human person from the very earliest stages of personhood to the very end, and everything in between. So even for a person who is in PVS, and unless there is what you might call death adequately understood, I'll say a little bit more about that later if I have time, we cannot withdraw the basic protections for such a person. And of course, as far as my subject for tonight is concerned, we certainly cannot withdraw it from people who may be, from our point of view, nearing the end of their lives. Of course, we never know whether they are or not. But what I would like to point out at this stage is that this Judeo-Christian idea of inalienable dignity has mutated. And what has it mutated into? It has mutated into autonomy. Now you see, autonomy is to the individual what relationship is to persons. So the human person, for the Bible and for the teaching of the church, is a relational being. You see, I am a person because of all the various relationships that I have had and have today. That is what has made me the person I am, and that's also true of you, and Christians would say that that's particularly true of our relationship with God. But autonomy is just about me, you see. It is a distortion of authentic personhood. And yet, as you know, autonomy is such a leading value nowadays in medicine and in other fields. And very often on questions of abortion and indeed of assisted suicide, this is what is pleaded. I am an autonomous being. Why can I not make my own decisions regardless of anyone else? In the case of abortion, regardless of the fetus and the value of the fetus, and where assisted suicide is concerned, regardless of society, of the common good, of other members of my family, and so on. The second basic Christian value is, of course, that of equality. Why equality? On the face of it, human beings are not equal. I mean, when I watch the Olympics, I'm very glad to watch them, but I know that I cannot perform, even remotely, like some of the athletes. Take an analogy that's perhaps nearer to me, and I mean, I can face fairly fast bowling, but I doubt if I could face Anderson at top speed when he's at the peak of his career. People are rich and they're poor. People are differently gifted. They have unequal starts in life. They inherit different things which may lead to prosperity or poverty. So why do we insist that human beings are equal? Well, it is the Bible's teaching of common origin, that all human beings have a common origin. This is set out, of course, in the story of creation. It is consistently taught in the Bible and has always been taught by the church. In Christ there is neither Jew nor Greek, male nor female, slave nor free. It's Galatians 3:28. The Bible teaches the common origin of human beings, and this is the basis for their equality. Now, Charles Darwin was actually very worried that his publication of the origin of the species would lead to racism. And he gave very large amounts of money to prevent this happening, particularly to the abolitionist cause in the United States. However, it did lead to racism in the southern United States, and then nearer home in the development of European fascism in the 1920s and 30s. If you abandon common origin, then you abandon biblical teaching about the equality of persons, big or small, unborn, growing up, fully grown, very old, whoever it may be. They're all equal because of their common origin in terms of God's purposes. I was at one time the chief executive of a large missionary organization, the Church Mission Society, and I used to read what the missionaries were up to in the 19th century. Well, you don't want to hear about everything they were up to. But I was reading about these CMS missionaries in Australia, and they were going from settler town to settler town, which was of course quite basic in those days, and preaching. And I discovered that sometimes they were thrown out of these towns. Why were they thrown out? Because they were preaching from the Acts of the Apostles, where St. Paul is preaching to the pagan Athenians, and this is in the older translation. In the old translation, it says that Paul said to them about God that out of one blood hath he made all the nations of men. And the settlers were unwilling to believe that, because they did not think that the Aboriginals were in any way like them. That's why they were thrown out. So common origin. Now again, this has mutated. This view of equality has mutated into not the equality of persons at whatever stage in life, but the equality of all sorts of lifestyles and behaviors. This is a very important change, and of course there is no end now to this claim to equality for this kind of behavior or that kind of lifestyle. And it will radically change our own self-understanding as persons and of societies. Liberty, as you know, Jesus never forced anyone to believe what he was saying and who he is. In the first 400 years of the church's history, the church was a persecuted community. It had no power to coerce anybody. In fact, all sorts of other people were trying to coerce the church. That is why we have so many martyrs whom we celebrate. Of course, the church has not always valued the teaching of Jesus about liberty and has been unfaithful to it and has tried to coerce people. But it is always possible to go back to what is fundamental. Pope Benedict, when he was Pope, I don't know what he is now, but Pope Emeritus, I suppose. But when he was Pope, he was asked by quite a hostile journalist who said, for centuries the Roman Catholic Church has taught that error has no rights. Why are you now emphasizing religious freedom for people? And Pope Benedict said, after thinking for a bit, he said, we are going back to the earliest form of the tradition, the teaching of Jesus himself. It's always possible to do that. But again, you see, Christian liberty has mutated into libertarianism. Libertarianism is very different from liberty. Liberty is about responsibility. It is about authentic freedom where we express our nature as God-given fully. But libertarianism, I used to come across a great deal in terms of bioethical legislation, for instance, where people would say, well, if it's possible to do it, let's do it. And there is no end to that, because science will always produce, every week, every month, every year, new possibilities. And ethics and moral thinking will always be struggling to keep up with this. Unless we have some basic view of personhood and of the value of persons, both as persons in themselves and as members of a community and of society generally. Now, one other point I suppose to make is that about safety. A great deal of money and time is spent on safety regulations and legislation in this country. The Health and Safety Executive is arguably the government. And that's good, there's nothing wrong with that. But have you noticed how it is always the safety of the individual, not of the common good, not of those institutions that are vitally needed, such as the family for society, and marriage, family, the welfare of children, I mean all of those things. It's all focused on the individual, and that only certain kinds of individuals who look rather like people who want their health and safety. You see, I mean, this is very important, that it's the recognition of humanity that is important. Whether it is denied on the basis of race, or development, or disability, or old age, whatever it may be. One thing that is important to say is that what we believe about persons is the result of a particular tradition. And it is quite possible that other traditions would not have given birth to this view of personhood. I mean, take Islam, for instance. Whatever else we may say about Islam, and I say a great deal about it, Islam will always emphasize social solidarity against the dignity and the value of the person, always. A Muslim friend of mine, very moderate Muslim, not an extremist by any means, said to me once, he said, "Bishop, we never know when you're fasting." So I said, well, you know, Jesus had said that people shouldn't know when you're fasting. And even before I'd finished, he said, but in Islam, fasting is a social act. And anyone who's been in a Muslim country during Ramadan will know what that means. So whether you're young, old, ill, pregnant, whatever, you have to be part of that social act. Hinduism is a great philosophical system. They've just discovered, actually in Pakistan as it happens, the earliest manuscript about the zero, you know, the invention of the zero, which of course we owe to Indian civilization. Great system, very well worth studying and commenting on. But Hinduism has the caste system. These days, the government is trying to bring in legislation to ban caste discrimination in this country. You know, race discrimination is forbidden, so is discrimination on the basis of gender and so on. But caste discrimination is not banned in this country. And the government is wanting to do so, but they are being opposed by the Hindu community. Because they see the recognition of caste as basic. Well, okay, we can argue about how it came into being and what it is and so on. But the point is that a religious system that has that as a basic way of organizing society is not going to give birth to the value of the person. That's the Buddhism. Well, I mean, you see what's happening in Myanmar these days. The West has got a kind of love affair with Buddhism. And again, it's a sublime system, worth studying. But the Dalai Lama, who's probably more popular than Jesus Christ in the West, sorry to say, but probably is the case, he keeps telling his adoring fans that there is no idea of the self in Buddhism. In fact, believing in the self in Buddhism is the source of all suffering, of dukkha. Okay? Well, very interesting idea. But a religious tradition that denies the existence of the self is not going to produce a very high view of the person, is it? So what I'm saying is that what we have is the product of a definite way of thought, of teaching, of tradition. And we stand to lose it if we don't recognize it. Now, coming then to what happens to people towards the end of their lives. I think it is very strange that at the very time when we are able to offer appropriate care and the management of pain for people in that situation, that at that very time there is this huge campaign to allow them to be helped to die. And it keeps coming back. I mean, Parliament has defeated this so many times in both houses, but it rebounds. Again and again, it keeps coming back. An ordinary member of Parliament may introduce a bill, and it might get a reading or two, and then nobody would hear about it again. But this matter keeps coming back. And the question is why? What is it? You know, you have members introducing bills, you have so-called independent commissions reporting. The BBC, in nearly all of its coverage on assisted dying, has been tilted in favor of it. What is causing all of this? My connections with the hospice movement were mentioned, and I'm very glad to own those connections and to own that I've learned a very great deal from the brave people who run these hospices, sometimes on a shoestring, because they want to retain their independence. But when we can care for people, as in the hospice movement, whether that is in residential hospices or in the very interesting hospice in the home movement, which, I mean, the hospice movement as a whole is of Christian inspiration, but certainly the hospice in the home movement is very much still run largely by Christians. Dame Cicely Saunders, the founder of the movement, used to say that last days are not lost days. So the aim of the movement is not just to ease people's pain, but to give them the opportunity to reflect, to repair any relationships that they wish to do so, to make their peace with other people and hopefully with God, all of those things. The management of pain, I mean, that is very important. Dignity in dying, the idea of a good death, I mean, all of this is part of the inspiration of the hospice movement. And yet at the very time when we can offer these spiritual and medical riches to people, there is this campaign to allow people to end their lives prematurely. Of course, doctors and medical workers, their duty is to promote and to enhance life when they can. But at the same time, they need not keep people alive in any kind of artificial way, officiously, as it is sometimes called. It is perfectly in order for people to refuse medical treatment, for instance, or indeed for medical people to decide that a particular medical treatment is not going to be productive for a particular patient. Now, having said that, we must reserve the position about nutrition and hydration, which are often confused with treatment. So I would say that even when treatment is refused by the patient or by medical people, hydration and nutrition should still be available unless it is very difficult to deliver it. I mean, there are cases where it is almost impossible to make sure that a patient is hydrated or receives nutrition. There is always the possibility, of course, of sedation, so where the intention is not to kill, but to relieve pain. Now, against this, we have this cry, first of all, about the wish of some terminally ill people to die, or so it is claimed. What is terminal illness? How do we know somebody is terminally ill? When are they going to die? I have a fellow bishop who was told, I was Bishop of Rochester from 1994, by the way. I think it was in 96 he was told he had 6 months to live. He resigned his see, went off into retirement, and I was reading in the papers the other day that he just celebrated his 85th birthday. See, so we don't know when people are going to die. A lad who was a neighbor in Bishop's Court in Rochester, almost the first thing that happened was his mother was on our doorstep saying that Johnny had been given 6 months to live. Well, she discovered that there was treatment available for him in America. Why is there treatment always available in America? And she was raising money. We helped her to do that. A friend of ours in America put them up in his house. They went. He had the operation. Johnny is a round, wonderful young man today. This is now 22, 23 years ago we're talking about. So we don't know if people are terminally ill. We do not know what is going to happen to people, and to presume to kill people just because they've been declared to be terminally ill is inexcusable, especially if it's set down in legislation. Secondly, there is this question of unbearable pain. Now, of course, there may well be cases where there is unbearable pain. I don't want to minimize people's pain. But I'm told by the leaders of the hospice movement that most pain can be managed. And I have observed them managing pain. Most pain can be managed. This does not mean that it disappears, but that it becomes bearable to some extent. And of course, as I was just saying, there is always the last resort of sedation. But then there are new arguments. I mean, I was reading yesterday, one new argument is my independence has been reduced by my illness. Well, the story of my life is my independence is progressively being reduced all the time. Today. I mean, all this campaigning against female genital mutilation of young girls, and I mean, that's great. But at the same time, we are giving permission for children to end their lives in this way. And this story will go on, of course. Now, what I want to say today is that it is not human life as such that we are talking about. I mean, my cells are human life. I shed them every day. Nobody minds. Nobody thinks it's murder. Human sperm is human life. We are not seeking to protect that. Female eggs are human life. What we are talking about is the person. And the reason we are protecting the unborn child is because the unborn child is seen by us as a person. And that would also be true of the person in a vegetative, so-called vegetative state, or the person who is nearing the end of his life, or a person who is who has some kind of chronic illness that they are weary about. Our regard for them must be on the basis of their personhood, made in God's image, redeemed by Jesus Christ. I mean, that's the Christian view, isn't it? And intended for eternal life. I mean, those are the reasons why we, as Christians, would certainly argue for the defense of the person. Now, when we do this, we are immediately faced with a barrage of criticism. And this takes several forms. One is reductionism. This is nothing buttery, you know. The human person is nothing but a bundle of chemical reactions. Or confusing our mind or our soul or our spirit with what happens inside our brains. This is all around us, and nothing buttery leads to the devaluing of the person, because the human person can only be fully appreciated as a spiritual and moral being, not just as a bundle of chemical reactions or of neurons firing or not firing, as the case may be, inside the brain. There is also, on the one hand, deconstruction. So there's nothing special about human beings. Look how near we are genetically to the apes or whatever. Deconstruction of the family. There's nothing important about the family. Anyone who shares a fridge is family. You know, this kind of talk that we hear so often. And then after the deconstruction, there is what you call constructivism. So that having destroyed everything that is in God's image, we then set out to make things in our own image. So the God-given distinction between man and woman is destroyed, and then we create our own image of who we are. This 6-year-old in school in the Isle of Wight that you may have heard about, some days he's a boy, other days he's a girl. Well, you may say that's permissible for a 6-year-old to be confused. But what is not permissible is for the grown-ups to be confused about him. There is a don in a famous university who puts out on his door who he is that day. And the students have to call him by that name, otherwise they get marked down. I mean, this is just madness, you see. This is constructing man and woman in our own image. And of course that means in the end there will be no man or woman left. And that may well be the intention. Thirdly, there is relativism. That is to say, there is no such thing as objective truth. You have your truth, I have mine, and they are equally good. against the teaching of the Bible and of the church about human nature, about the nature of the world, about our fellow creatures, about God's purposes for His world and our fellow creatures and ourselves. All of that is abandoned simply to say whatever you think today is as good as what the church has taught for 2,000 years. Now, there are signs of hope in this. People are beginning to see where this is leading. I think this is one of the reasons why Jacob Rees-Mogg is being so favorably received. That people are beginning to see the absurdity of what they are doing, or what they're being led into by our leaders, I have to say. Well, let there be more Jacob Rees-Moggs, I say, in this world. It is about time we had politicians of conviction. I was rung up by an MP last week, and to his credit, he was asking me for advice about a moral issue that he was facing in Parliament, and I gave him advice. But he said, you know, they will say to me, you're out of touch. And I said, look, of course you must take into account what your constituents think. But you are also there to lead. You're not just to follow. And this is what our politicians have become. They've become followers of focus groups, of the latest opinion poll, however slanted it may be in one direction or another. And it's about time we had people, not irresponsibly, but people who have thought about things and then with conviction decide to lead. If nobody follows, well, we'll find out, won't we? But it may be that some people may just follow a politician who speaks and acts with conviction. So that is, those are the sorts of things I wanted to share with you this evening. But I'm very happy for a pushback on any or all of them. Many thanks indeed.